Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good night, depending on wherever you might be in the world today. And welcome to the next episode of Global Crisis, Global Solidarity, a bi-weekly discussion show hosted by the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung and streaming live from Berlin. The Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung is one of the major political foundations in Germany. We promote political education and research in the spirit of our namesake, the iconic socialist leader Rosa Luxemburg. And we also operate 25 offices around the world and see ourselves as a facilitator of dialogue between labor, left movements, scholars, and other left-wing forces. Every first and third Wednesday of the month, Global Crisis, Global Solidarity welcomes a number of thinkers, activists, and partners of the Foundation from around the world to develop a better understanding of the current crisis or crises affecting our world, and also to take a closer look at what kinds of political strategies an internationalist left has to deploy today to rise to the moment. My name is Lauren Balhorn, and joining me as always is Fida Al-Zanin. We'll be hosting a discussion with today's guest and also be taking questions and comments from viewers on both YouTube and Facebook. We'll do our best to include as many questions as we can, so if you have anything you want to throw or contribute to the discussion, just type it into the chat box. Today we're talking about debt, but not just any kind of debt. A lot of people, when they think about debt, they might think about credit card debt, they might think about their mortgage, they might think about student loan debt, but we want to talk about something a bit broader, national debt, and specifically the debts that many countries in the global south owe to the countries of the global north and to international financial institutions. These sorts of debts, these massive debts, function as a brake on development and indeed perpetuate the gap between the global north and the global south that was supposed to have been addressed or ended with the end of colonialism decades ago, but is of course in reality not. For that reason, we're very pleased to welcome today's guest, who is both an expert on the topic and also a colleague of ours, Dr. Ndongo Sylla, a development economist with our Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung office in Dakar, Senegal, and also co-author of a forthcoming book titled Africa's Last Colonial Currency, The CFA Franc Story. He's written prolifically on questions of debt, international finance in magazines like Jacobin, and is also a leading advocate of modern monetary theory, or MMT, on the African continent. So Ndongo, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Hi, Lauren. Thanks for your invitation. Hi, Fida.
So first things first, we want to start with kind of an introductory question. The formal decolonization of the global south, so the end of formal European dominance over the countries of Africa, large parts of Asia, is decades behind us. And yesterday was, in fact, the 60th anniversary of the independence for Congo, a country that suffered under European domination the most. Today, 60 years later, every country in Africa is an independent state. They are full members of the United Nations, and many also all of them are also organized in the African Union, which is an independent continental body representing the countries of Africa on the world stage. So obviously, at least on an institutional level, we've come a long way. But to what extent do you think, Ndongo, can you say that colonialism or colonial relations are really over?
Yeah, that is a very good question. Because at the wake of the independencies, we had a leader, Kwame Nkrumah. He was the president of Ghana, and he fought for the independence of Ghana. He wrote a book saying that about neocolonialism. That was his way of understanding, let's say, the challenges brought by the conquest of independence, because he was saying that there was a formal phase of colonialism that was now over. Let's say the phase where there was a government by, let's say, metropolitan imperialist countries. But now what happened after independence was that the economic structures were still, the economic structures, let's say, built during the colonial period were still in full force in many African countries. That was what he called the neocolonialism, to say, for example, that the banking sector, the mining sector, and most important sectors in the productive economy were controlled by, let's say, foreign capital. And that what he called neocolonialism. In most countries in Africa, until now, we see that this neocolonial, let's say, structuring of this of the productive sector, is still in full force. So that's why, many organizations, intellectual, are fighting to get rid of that legacy.
Like a lot of your work is centered around charting a pathway towards financial sovereignty for the countries of the global south. So, could you tell us a bit more what exactly financial sovereignty means and why has it proved so elusive for countries around the, like across West Africa?
Financial sovereignty is very important. For me, it's the basis of everything. It's not enough, but you have to have at least, let's say, a minimum in terms of financial sovereignty, monetary sovereignty. And by monetary sovereignty, me and other people, we mean at least the possibility for governments to spend in their own currency on the terms they have chosen themselves. That means to have some room of maneuver vis-a-vis, let's say, the international markets. For example, if the Ghanaian government want to spend for public purpose, the Ghanaian government will be able to do that with a minimum of constraints. That means that there is no limit in terms of financing, and the cost of the financing is also determined by the government, and the government has, let's say, some control on the banking system. Those are, let's say, some elements of monetary sovereignty. And in most African countries, even those who issue their currency themselves and are monetarily sovereign at a formal level, they still do not have, let's say, a minimum in terms of monetary sovereignty, because they are indebted in foreign currencies, and they do not have, let's say, often a control on the banking system, which is generally foreign dominated.
But first, I would like to ask you about your upcoming book, Africa's Last Colonial Currency, the CFA Franc Story. What is the CFA Franc Story? What's the story behind the name? How was it created? How it works? And also, how did the French manage to impose it on African countries?
That's a very good question. Uh, the CFA franc was born during the colonial period in 1945, after the Second World War. And it was born as out of a devaluation of the French franc, because at that time there was something called the monetary unity. That means one currency circulating in different forms in a whole empire. And this was a matter of pride, let's say, for the French metropolitan, let's say, imperial interest. One currency for a whole empire. But after the Second World War, the French economy was very weak, and the French economy did not have enough, let's say, foreign exchange reserve to maintain, let's say, a certain peg with the dollar. So the French currency had to be devalued. So the technical question was whether we should have a single rate of devaluation for the whole empire, or have differential rates of devaluation. And what happened was that the Ministry of Finance at that time in Paris decided that there would be different rates of devaluation of the French currency. And those differential rates of devaluation gave birth to what was called the colonial francs, and the CFA franc was among them. And when it was born, the CFA franc meant franc of the French colonies in Africa, and it was circulating in the, let's say, sub-Saharan part of the French Empire. And what was really amazing was that this currency had an external value higher than the French franc. For the British colonies, that was not the same case, because the British pound had a higher value than colonial currencies, let's say in Nigeria, Ghana, etc. But for the French, they decided to give the CFA franc a higher value than the French franc, and that would continue, let's say, for 4 decades, you see. So when the other African countries obtained their independence, in the case of the sub-Saharan part of the French Empire, France tried to prevent real decolonization because let's say, African leaders were trained in France and they have, let's say, some common interests with French elites. So France made them sign what was called cooperation agreements. Cooperation agreements were, let's say, agreements on many sovereign domains like currency, trade, like diplomacy, armed forces, etc. The deal was, I'll give you independence, but you'll have no sovereignty, and especially monetary sovereignty and sovereignty on your resources. And we obtained independence on that basis. And that's why we still use the CFA franc, while most other countries have their own currency.
This leads me to our next question. Speaking of the harms of the CFA franc, or the question would be like, has the CFA franc been challenged by the African nations in the past, speaking historically?
Yeah, there have been many attempts from various social groups. At the time of independence, there was some head of states which were, let's say, Pan-Africanists and who wanted to challenge French domination. That started in 1958 with the Guinean president and trade unionist Sekou Touré. He wanted to have its own national currency, but the reprisal from France was to inundate Guinea with false banknotes, and that disrupted the economy. There was another leader, Sylvanus Olympio, who was trained at the London School of Economics. He wanted to issue its own national currency. He made, let's say, all the appropriate legal change to issue its own national currency, but he was killed before the launch of the national currency. So Togo is still with the CFA franc. We had another leader, Modibo Keita, who was a socialist and who was also advised by someone like Samir Amin at that time. He wanted also to break up with the Franc zone. He escaped for 5 years, but Mali was brought back to the French, let's say, monetary empire. But in the 1970s, there was also a challenge from some head of states and some intellectuals, including the likes of Samir Amin, who said that this is a colonial setting and we have to break out this colonial setting so that we have a monetary system which is more conducive to development. France accepted to give some concessions. For example, the headquarters of the central banks, because there are two central banks, one in West Africa, the other in Central Africa, they were moved, their headquarters were moved to Dakar and Yaoundé, and their staff were Africanized because 100% of their staff were French. And yeah, monetary policy was decided in Paris, but after it was moved in the mid 70s, in Africa. But still, monetary policy is decided by France because France is still represented in the organs of both the central banks. And yeah, so France is still sovereign on those two currencies using the same name, the CFA franc. And recently, during the last 5 years, there had been a very popular movement, because it's the first time we have a popular movement, a popular Pan-Africanist movement asking for the abolition of the CFA franc. And that is something really, to be welcomed.
To follow up on that, on the opposition in the recent years of the CFA franc, on the other hand, we have some economists within Africa that do support and are in favor of retaining the CFA franc. They have their own claims that it's solid, it's a stable currency, and it keeps inflation down. What do you think of these critics? Like, what are your insights on that?
Yeah, there are many intellectuals who are favorable for the status quo regarding the CFA franc. But this is not a surprise because in Africa, let's say in the universities, neoclassical economics reigns supreme. So there is this of, let's say, market fundamentalism, which is taught to our students by our teachers, by our professors. And most financial people, they also believe in those sound finance principles, having a low inflation, a stable peg to the euro, etc. So I can understand from their point of view that they support the CFA franc. But the so-called stability of the CFA franc have enormous costs. And the cost is, for example, there is no long-term growth. If you take, for example, the case of Senegal, between, let's say, since our independences until 2015, the rate of growth was virtually nil. That means in 2015, we had the same GDP per capita in real terms than at the beginning of independence. You take the case of Cote d'Ivoire, its GDP per capita in real terms is still lower than its best level in 1978. You see, and that is also the case for the biggest countries of the CFA franc zone. You take the case of Cameroon, Congo, Republic, and also Gabon. It's still the same pattern. Why? Because the peg to the euro and before to the French franc is asphyxiating the economy. Because the only way they could defend this peg is to, let's say, reduce the financing of the economy. That's the way they manage this peg. That means through reducing demand, through reducing potential, let's say, economic growth. And so this stability has a huge cost. And also this arrangement has proved, let's say, very favorable to illicit financial flows, because we know that the CFA franc zone suffers also a lot from illicit financial flows. So yeah, these are the counterparts of this so-called stability.
Could you explain what you mean by illicit financial flows? Are you talking about criminal money or tax avoidance?
Yeah, generally when we talk about illicit financial flows, is that financial flows which exited the continent on an illicit basis. And generally the most dominant, let's say, component is what is called the trade mispricing. That means, for example, most foreign companies, they will, let's say, overprice their imports when they declare it, and they will underestimate the prices of their exports. And so it is a way of camouflaging the real prices and the real flows between those groups. Sometimes they could even, you have a branch, let's say in Senegal, and the branch is borrowing money to the headquarters, let's say in Paris. Maybe the real interest rate will be 1%, but they will charge 10%. So those are kind of a practice that is bleeding Africa. And when you take into account those illicit financial flows, you realize that Africa is not a net debtor to the rest of the world, but a net creditor to the rest of the world.
You mentioned headquarters in Paris. I want to stick with that theme for a second, because I know that the situation, the currency situation in West Africa is very dynamic at the moment, and we'd like to talk about the new common currency, the ECO, in a minute. But before that, I know that the French Parliament is currently debating no longer holding 50% of West African franc currency reserves. Could you explain why they hold those currency reserves and what kind of dependencies or concrete benefits France, as the former colonial country, gets from this arrangement?
Yeah, that's a very good question. This arrangement dates back from the colonial period, let's say in 1939, because in 1939, it was created what was called the Franc zone, like there was the Sterling area. At that time, there was, let's say, strong imperialist rivalries between, let's say, Germany, France, England, etc. So France decided, let's say, to protect herself, let's say, within the empire. And so they decided to have, let's say, the same rules for the empire. And among those rules were the fixed peg. So the currencies of the colonies were pegged to the French franc at that time. There was also what was called the free transfer principle. That means the companies could invest, disinvest, could also repatriate their profits and capitals easily with no restriction. And there was a third principle. The third principle was that there was what was called the French guarantee of convertibility. What that means is that whenever the central bank in West Africa, for example, is short of foreign exchange reserves, that means $0, $0 US dollar, the French Treasury, not the Bank of France, the French Treasury will lend the desired amounts of euros to the Central Bank of West Africa. That is the meaning of this pompous term, French guarantee of convertibility. But the counterpart to that is that the central bank must deposit with the French treasury half of these foreign exchange reserves. After independence, it was 100%. And between 1973 and the mid 2000s, it was 65%. And now this has been the object of criticism for many, let's say, intellectuals, Pan-Africans. They say why African countries should have their foreign exchange reserve controlled by payers who can use it, etc. And so this was really embarrassing for France, and they tried to camouflage it. That's why in December, last December, 21st of December, the French President Emmanuel Macron and his Ivorian counterpart Alassane Ouattara, they did what they call to put an end to the CFA franc. And what was the content of the reform? First, they would rename the CFA franc because, as I said, originally it was a franc of the French colonies in Africa, but now it's a franc of the financial community in West Africa, and for Central Africa is franc of the financial corporation in Central Africa. And now they want to change the name because the acronym was so criticized. The second thing they said, now the central bank will no longer be obliged to deposit, let's say, 50% of its foreign exchange reserve to the French treasury, because this was also criticized. And the last thing they said, now there will be no longer any representative from France in the central bank, because France was represented in the organs of the central bank and had a veto right implicitly in the management of monetary policy. And those three aspects were meant, let's say, to get rid of the most embarrassing symbols around the CFA franc. But still, the pillars are there. The fixed peg to the euro is there. The free transferability is there. And the monetary cooperation agreement between France and the 8 countries using the CFA franc West Africa had been renewed. So that means it's a new cooperation, like at the wake of independencies. It's just a new monetary cooperation, but maintaining the same pillars and the same form of, let's say, monetary imperialism between France and most of its former colonies. So there is no change at all. Normally, they were saying that today they will launch the ECO. What is amazing is that ECO is short for ECOWAS, and ECOWAS is the Economic Community of West African States. So ECO was the name chosen for the single currency project of the 15 countries of ECOWAS. So it was really amazing for many people to see France and Cote d'Ivoire trying to hijack, let's say, the single currency project of West Africa.
Excellent. First off, thanks a lot for all of your insights. I think a lot of people outside of Africa probably aren't even really aware of the West African franc, let alone the depth with which you've detailed it. And that's actually what we wanted to get to next before we take up a couple questions from the chat room. Is today is the official inauguration of the ECO as a new common currency of ECOWAS, like you were explaining, and that's something that's been a process that dates back to the early 2000s, if I recall correctly. There have been a number of attempts to create a common West African currency. There have been divisions between various states. So we can kind of already anticipate it based on what you just said, but we would like to get your input on this current ECO being enacted. To what extent, if you could maybe just explain some of the background, what some of the conflicts and disagreements have been within ECOWAS, but also, do you see this as in any ways a real step towards some kind of financial sovereignty for West Africa, or is this simply a rebranding exercise?
Yeah, in fact, yeah, as you said, there have been many attempts to launch a single currency for the 15 countries of West Africa, but the project has often been postponed. Why? Because the approach is not sound. In West Africa, we have tried within the framework of the ECOWAS to, let's say, to mimic what the countries sharing the euro have done. That means following the Maastricht criteria. So having a low deficit, having a low GDP debt GDP ratio, and so on. We have tried to follow that approach, but that approach is not working for economies which are very volatile, and that explains why it has been postponed very, very often. And now what happens is that the 15 countries of the ECOWAS, last year they said that they would like to launch the ECO this year. But France and Cote d'Ivoire stepped in and said, no, we will launch the ECO, it's the CFA franc. We will rebrand the CFA franc. But if you see concretely, there is no operational meaning to launching the ECO of the, let's say, of the 8 countries using the CFA franc. Why? Because there is a conflict on the name. The name originally was for the single currency of the 15 countries of ECOWAS. Maybe they will disagree with that, and the Nigerian president already said that he's not, let's say, he doesn't like the way the thing is handled by France and Cote d'Ivoire. The second thing is that when you want to launch a new currency, yeah, but you have to at least inform the population who use the currencies, you see. But for now, there has been no communication at all around this so-called ECO. In the case of the Eurozone, we know that the euro was launched in 1999, but just as structural currency, and 3 years later as a, let's say, fiduciary currency. For now, there is no plan at all, let's say, to print, let's say, new banknotes, etc., to replace the CFA franc. So it's just a way of saying that we want to get rid of that name, but beyond that, there is nothing at all. The proof is that I still have no ECO with me, just my own CFA franc. Oh.
So it's a rebranding of the old CFA franc. We have this question from the audience. For those people living in the global south, how this colonial debt shows up in their everyday lives? How can we recognize its effects on their daily activities, initiatives nowadays? How does it show up in their life?
Yeah, it shows up in many ways. Because every time we talk about paying the debt, servicing the debt, it's not the government, it's not the elites, it's the ordinary populations who service the debt, and they service the debt through lower public spending on health care, on education, on civil services, and also on most public services, you see. In the rural zone, you will see there will be no support, genuine support for the rural producers. You will see that the size of the informal sector will grow disproportionately, etc. All those are signs of the constraint of having to service the debt, the external debt.
So, Ndongo, let's talk about so you've explained to us what financial sovereignty would mean. How can states of the global south, countries of the global south, formerly colonized countries who suffered from hundreds of years of exploitation on a geopolitical scale, how does obtaining financial and monetary sovereignty, how does that move us towards a more equal world, or somehow closing the gap between the North and South? I mean, what kinds of other policies would be necessary? Because certainly simply having control of your currency is not enough to make up for hundreds of years of colonial exploitation, no?
Yeah. We have to change the global structures for sure, because the global structures are not favorable for, let's say, most countries in the global south who still, let's say, maintain an economic specialization they inherited from colonialism. Most countries in Africa are still raw material exporters, and they are importers of like manufacturers and high value added services. So that means that whenever you have, let's say, a commodity boom, yeah, you have economic growth. But when the prices of the raw materials decline, like with the pandemics, you see that, yeah, they will be in economic contraction, and they will have a lot of, let's say, economic difficulties. That is happening with Nigeria, with South Africa, the two biggest countries in Africa. Yeah, so that means we have to change this economic specialization. But it's not easy to change this economic specialization. Why? Because the most important economic decisions are not taken by African states, but are taken by those who have, let's say, capital, and they decide where they want to invest and, yeah, how they invest. So that has been the pattern during colonialism, and it's still now the case. When foreign direct investment comes in Africa, it's mostly in the extractive sectors. And the extractive sectors, they just pump out your economic surplus. That means the savings that could be used to develop the economy domestically will be, let's say, pumped out, to be used somewhere else. So we have to, let's say, to stop this financial bleeding by trying to mobilize domestic resources. And monetary sovereignty is really important to that end, because that means that you have to, let's say, to promote, to privilege local finance over, let's say, international finance. If you have the resources, and Africa have the real resources, so you could rely on your domestic, let's say, banking capabilities to try to finance what could be financed in your own currency.
You mentioned that the people who make the economic decisions are usually the people who have the capital. On that note, stepping away from the European-African relationship for a minute, let's talk about the People's Republic of China, which is currently the single biggest foreign lender to the African continent and to African countries. What do you make, for example, of the Chinese government's recent announcement that it will dedicate $2 billion to coronavirus relief as part of a wide-ranging debt relief program for many African countries? Do you think that the Chinese or China is a qualitatively different lender and a different kind of economic partner than the West has been?
Yeah, I would say that China has its own distinct approach towards Africa, because China was not a formal, let's say, colonial power. So that means a lot for many African countries. And China also does not lecture African countries on, let's say, human rights, democracy, and so on. And at the same time, we have seen that China has been more efficient in building some kind of infrastructures, etc. But still, China acts like any imperialist power. That means China want to secure raw materials, want to secure, let's say, markets for its companies, want to have some influence on Africa, because China want to, let's say, to extend its influence, etc. So that means that so there are some differences, let's say, in the approach, but still the Chinese approach maintains African countries in the economic specialization they inherited from colonialism. And that's why you see, for example, Angola, the countries which is the most indebted, let's say, towards China, is still in the, let's say, in the oil business. When the oil prices are good, there's economic growth, and when the oil prices are down, you have a lot of difficulties. And it's still interesting to see, for example, last year, Angola issued, let's say, a Eurobond to partly, let's say, service its debt to China. And now China is coming back saying that, yeah, I want to reduce the debt of African countries, because there have been some pressures from Western powers say that China is not playing the game, etc. You see, but it still remains, let's say, a game between, let's say, dominant hegemonic powers, and this has to change. We have to change the partnership with China as well as the traditional Western powers. But about the debt, we must say that China is not the most important, let's say, it's not the main obstacle, I would say, because now the main obstacle in Africa to, let's say, to solve this external debt crisis is the debt held by the private creditors. Because before, the type of debt we have was debt owed like to the likes of the World Bank, the IMF, and to, let's say, individual countries like Germany, like Japan, France, etc. But now, more or less 42% in 2018 of Africa's public external debt was owed to private creditors through, let's say, Eurobonds that had been issued by African countries. And those private creditors, they don't want to cancel the debt. They do not want to, let's say, to discuss about, let's say, a standstill or even, some debt relief. So this is the huge issue about Africa's debt now.
So if we're talking about, or if the goal is to move beyond a situation where the economic relations between Africa and the rest of the world, or at least the industrialized world, is one of a peripheral, subordinate exporter region and dominant industrialized and financially powerful states, what kinds of strategies can African states deploy? I know that you're an outspoken advocate of MMT, modern monetary theory, and the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung actually hosted a pretty large and important conference last year in Tunis about applying MMT in the African context, which you were also a big part of. So could you maybe just lay out why you think that MMT, I mean, it's becoming increasingly popular also in the United States and Great Britain, like it's certainly an in vogue idea, but what would it mean in African countries, in relatively poor countries? How would MMT help them to bolster economic growth or create a more balanced playing field?
Yeah, MMT is the short for modern monetary theory, and it has been, let's say, promoted by major thinkers, let's say, in the West, in the United States, in Australia, etc., and also by our colleague Fadel Kaboub, Denison University, with whom we organized last year a big conference in Tunis with other Clusian colleagues, Ines and Maha, and also Prof. Kai Kodenbrock in Kote University. And next year in Dakar, we'll have the second edition. And why we are really interested in promoting MMT is that MMT shows clearly how the monetary system works. And MMT teaches that when you are a sovereign currency issuer, that means you have your own national currency, your own central bank, you have a control on your central bank, and you do not, let's say, issue, let's say, bonds in other countries' currency. This type of government have, let's say, strong, let's say, financial room for maneuver. That means this kind of country could fund whatever could be funded in its own currency. That means that country is not obliged, let's say, to borrow money abroad to fund what could be funded using its own real resources. For example, most African countries, they have land, they have, let's say, agricultural knowledge, yeah, they have manpower, etc. Those kind of those kind of countries, if they use their monetary powers, let's say, in a rational way, they could be able to develop their agricultural sector without relying on foreign finance. And that is what is interesting with MMT, because MMT describes how the monetary system works, and from there, MMT teaches that what is important is the real resources. What kind of resources do you have? If you have real resources, you should not, let's say, be worried about how to finance it, because how to finance it should not be a problem if you understand how the monetary system works. And I think this is a really powerful insight for, let's say, African policymakers, and we are trying to do our best to explain to people why it's important to have a minimum of monetary sovereignty, and why having a minimum of monetary sovereignty can help us develop, let's say, some sectors like the agricultural sectors, but also try to have, let's say, full employment types of policies, because MMT is also advocating, let's say, at a practical level, the idea of a job guarantee. And these are things also which could be important, because in the Africa, in most of Africa, the aggregate demand is low, and the countries could not rely on exports because often they are not very competitive, etc. That means they have to rely on their own domestic markets. But with a scheme like the job guarantee, you could increase aggregate demand and also increase the possibilities for domestic firms, let's say, to develop, etc. So there are many potential uses we could make of MMT.
Thanks so much for all of your time, Ndongo. We're almost out, but I want to ask you one last question before we have to wrap up this episode. You know, the name of our show, as I'm sure you know at this point, is Global Crisis, Global Solidarity. We know what the crisis is. In many ways, you could argue that colonialism is a crisis lasting hundreds of years that has not ended to this day. But we want to ask you a little bit about global solidarity, right? I mean, obviously, there are massive economic, social, cultural gaps between the industrialized North and large parts of the global South. Do you think that something like a global solidarity is possible? And maybe more specifically, can tools like MMT help to heal these rifts or close these gaps and put us on the way towards something more like a truly equal global community?
Yeah, I think it's possible, but most of all, it's necessary, because if you want to tackle the, let's say, climate change, this has to be done in a framework of global solidarity. This is the main, let's say, threat, the main challenge humanity is facing. And that means that if we look at how the monetary system works, the world has the means, financial means, has resources, the real resources, let's say, to organize, let's say, the humanity in a better way so that everybody could live, let's say, a decent life and within the respect of, let's say, the ecological limits. That is possible. We could not say that the humanity lacks financial means to tackle climate change. We have the financial means. Now we have to have the political will to change all of that. And if we are to achieve, let's say, that objective, we need global solidarity. That means more help to the global south. But when we say more help, that means renewed form of helps which are not, let's say, driven by imperial interests and so on, capitalist logic, but how to live better in a world, let's say, of equals.
Thanks. I think we're going to leave it there. That's a great note to leave it at. We want to thank everyone for watching. Thank you again to Dr. Ndongo Samba Sylla from our West Africa office in Dakar for spending this time with us today. I'm Lauren Balhorn, joined as always by Fida Al-Zanin. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Rosa-Lux_global. Feel free to leave us suggestions for future topics or guests we should invite to the show by using the hashtag Global Solidarity. We'll be back in 2 weeks on July 15th at 3 p.m. Central European Time, discussing actually a very related topic to what Ndongo just finished on, namely discussing the Green New Deal from a Global South perspective. We're going to be joined by Maristela Svampa, an Argentinian sociologist and activist who's part of a new initiative called the Social, Ecological, Economic, and Intercultural Pact for Latin America, to get an idea or get a perspective from the Global South about what a really truly global and truly just Green New Deal would mean. So, yeah, that's it from us here in Berlin. Thanks a lot for your time, and see you in 2 weeks.